So let me first tell you about this panel. So we had this brilliant idea a couple years ago to do a panel, and the way it came about was that one of the speakers called us about 10 minutes before their time to speak and said, "Hey, I'm not going to make it." And so I couldn't find anybody to fill in. So I went in the vendor hall and I said, you, and you're on my panel. Let's go in here and set up some tables. So we came in here, we did an impromptu panel. Nobody even knew it. And on the reviews afterwards, people said, that was the best talk ever, having a panel, just a discussion. It was so cool. So we started doing it every year since then. So this came about from a mishap, and here we are. I think this is the fourth or fifth year we've done the panel discussion. It usually goes over pretty good. So I'll introduce our panelists. And so first we've got, in order, we've got Gene Gant, who is the CEO of Aventa LLC. Also known as Dad, sometimes known as Brother. Yeah, and so I'll tell you a funny story about that at some point today. Anyway, then we have Carrie Hilton Profit, who's the VP of Clinical Operations for Encore. We have Boone Lockhart, who is the Director of Respiratory for the VGM group. We have Tim Safely, which is the Program Director for ACHC, for the Accreditation Commission for Healthcare. And then Dr. Landon, who you guys heard speak earlier, who's part of or runs Landon Pediatric Foundation. So the way this panel normally works, since the impromptu works so good, I decided to keep it that way every year. So I never tell the panelists the questions so they can prepare. You know, if anybody knows me, I'm one of those guys that I just like to over prepare for everything, right? So I spend months preparing for these types of things, and so I think it's more fun to do impromptu questions. So I'm going to be asking the questions. Normally the panelists can actually see the screen with the questions, but we just saw that didn't work out. So I'm going to ask the questions, and we're just going to have kind of a discussion, have a good time, and then at the end we'll open it up so you guys can ask questions, okay? So the first question that we're going to talk about, and you guys can just take turns, whoever wants to speak up first, no formalities here. And so in the pandemic, when we started the public health emergency, RTs were all over the news, right? We were everywhere. All of a sudden we had all this great press. And so it was one of those things that I was excited about because we were in a pandemic, but the fact that we were getting all this press, right? So the question is, how do you think that has affected the profession, and what does that look like now? We don't see it as much now, and so did it do us any good? How have we capitalized on that? You know, just talk about a little bit that press that we got during the pandemic and what we see now today.
I think, okay, perfect. I think it drew a lot of us as RTs back into the hospital care setting. Primarily I focus on home care, respiratory therapy in the home care setting, and we're having a terrible time finding RTs that are willing to, get into the home care setting or move out of the acute care setting. So I think that's one of the biggest things that the pandemic has brought to the RT field.
Well, we sure make a lot more money now because that's something that I think everybody's agree on. And I think it also brought a lot more therapists into the long-term care settings because the nursing facilities see the importance of having respiratory therapists now as well.
Yeah, and I think it was a double-edged sword. Number one, we did get a lot of recognition, but at the same time, we saw a lot of our colleagues that just couldn't handle it. The stress was too much during COVID. We lost a lot of people. But one thing that did come out of it was we got a lot of press. Everybody knows who we are now. There's no doubt about that. But it also gave us a little bit of a negative press because now the kids or younger people that are thinking about going into healthcare have a second look at this profession because of what did happen with COVID. So right now nationally we have a shortage of therapists, There are about 170,000 of us right now. By 2032, I believe, is the date, they expect 90,000 to retire. The schools are down in enrollment by 25% across the board, across the country. So we're going to have less of us to work with over the next several years. It's not going to rebound quickly, no matter what we do. Even if every one of us went out and recruited 10 people to go into respiratory therapy tomorrow, it's going to be 2 years before they're in the field and out functioning. So I do encourage everybody to not play down our field, but to play it up and to encourage young people to get into our field because we need them. I mean, it's a great opportunity for them at this point in time.
One of the biggest things that we saw in home care was the creativity of respiratory therapists. Now, I've been a respiratory therapist for a number of years, some before y'all were even born. And I think one of the things that happens for that is we've always been extremely creative. All of a sudden we got press, but we got press of who respiratory therapy was as part of the healthcare team. But more importantly, we used creativity, especially to deliver some different home care models. Not only do we have this issue during the pandemic, we also had recall issues during the pandemic. Although the pandemic didn't cause that, it certainly was something else we had to deal with. We still had to give therapy in the home. And by giving the therapy in the home, not getting people back to the hospital, because home is a much better place to treat patients if you can do it. I saw tremendous creativity. I saw new ideas generated. And I saw a whole new infection control processes that we probably should have used 20 years ago and hadn't. We had the technology. So I think we need to hold respiratory therapists and keep pushing the need for respiratory therapists, not only in the home environment, but also under Medicare Part A, which I'll talk about later, and also in the hospital, because now we have the ability to say who is a respiratory therapist. We can refer back to that.
Yeah, so as a pulmonologist, healthcare heroes, without a doubt. But I have respiratory therapists come in my clinic, and some days they wouldn't show up. Sorry, I've been on night shift for 5 nights in a row. So I think that there's an impact there, especially if you're a junior person. The pulmonary rehab shut down, our PFT lab shut down. And when I look at the restaurants in my town, half of them shut down during the COVID. So it's coming back. And so picking exactly what you want to do and how we're going to provide those services, I think, is still up in the air.
Yeah, good points. You answered 2 of my next questions without me asking them. So you guys are doing a phenomenal job. And so to your point, Gene, I want to highlight something, which is we got good press, but it also really negatively affected us. And what I mean by that is because so many of us were burnt out. Most people go into respiratory because they have a family member that's sick, because they have a family member that's a respiratory therapist, right? Or because they want to make a difference and they pick a healthcare field. So most people in this room, I've polled hundreds of people with those questions, and that's usually the answer. But I think that one of the reasons enrollment is down is because we have a really negative outlook. Like Gene mentioned, that a lot of us got burnt out during COVID, and we didn't go home and talk about how great our job was. We went home and talked about how horrible it was. And when somebody said, what do you do? And you're a respiratory therapist. Never do that, right? You don't want to get into respiratory. And we did that just because it was a gut reaction of what we were going through. But we're seeing the effects of that now, that even though we got positive press, the numbers of school enrollment are down. And they're struggling. I mean, the schools are struggling to find people that will enroll. We're all struggling in the hospital. We're struggling in post-acute care. And so we've got a huge struggle on our hands. So the question is, what can we do to help recruit respiratory therapists? What's some ways that the audience here can get involved in that? And maybe some ideas that you guys have seen of how companies or organizations are starting to help in that recruitment effort.
Well, I talked about some of those in my talk, and that is telemedicine. And really being able to do pulmonary rehab at a distance, being able to do pulmonary function testing at a distance, being able to get into the nursing homes at a distance, being able to run a ventilator pretty soon at a distance, so that there's less of that burnout.
Gene, where you at? Just building on that. I mean, a lot of people went to working from home during the pandemic, and I feel like it's also helped us as therapists evolve as in what we do on a daily basis as well, where they have a neighbor that's working from home, they envy that neighbor from working from home. I think there's a lot of opportunity coming down the road for therapists to be based in their home and remote monitoring.
So one of the other things, whenever I got out of respiratory school, one of the first things I did was join the TSRC, the Tennessee Society for Respiratory Care. And so one of the things that I think has really negatively impacted our profession too is that most of those state societies have all but disappeared. And we don't have state meetings. How many of you guys, your states have had a state meeting in the last year? A couple? So most states haven't had state meetings. The boards have really dropped off. Nobody's engaged. And that is our advocacy board. And so we've got to figure out how to do something about that, because those are the groups that are going to advocate for us, advocate for our profession, get into the schools and find ways to recruit more therapists. And so we have this challenge across the country that we have lost therapists, people aren't getting in the field, and we've lost a lot of our advocacy that we used to have. And right before COVID, the AARC was focusing more on post-acute care. COVID happened, it went all back to acute care. And so we really don't have anybody advocating for our profession other than the AARC at a national level, but locally. And so we have to do something about that. We got to get back involved, and I'm going to get back involved. I'm going to recruit my father to get back involved with me. So now is the time, though, that I know we're all busy, we all have stressful lives, but this profession is one that we all care about and want to see grow and thrive. And now we're in a crisis. And so it's going to take us helping with that crisis. Bob?
I was just going to add on the advocacy side, in Florida, we met on the respiratory side, but another group we have to really pick up the ball for and help strengthen is the state societies for cardiopulmonary rehab.
Yep.
Because they're really struggling.
Yes, the pulmonary rehabs are struggling, and we see these new remote models that are coming out that are really interesting and are probably going to be the future of that space. But they definitely are struggling to get open back up and to get going again. So I want to talk a little bit about the hospital side. And I know that when we talk about how we were affected in the hospital, obviously during COVID, any RTs in the hospital were affected. But what's that practice look like today? So I want to ask the panel, any of you guys, what are the changes that have happened on the acute care side? Maybe Dr. Landon would be have some good insight on that. So how's the practice of respiratory care changed in the hospital post-pandemic, if you can say that?
And they give the microphone to the guy that hadn't worked in a hospital in 25 years.
Well, I was trying to save you. That's why I sit down this way.
We'll pass it back down to Dr. Landon, but I want to follow up on one other thing a while ago. What we can do, I'm sorry to backtrack, but what we can do right now as therapists to try to increase the enrollment in school is for each of y'all to do some outreach to your local schools, local high schools. Say you'd be willing to come and talk and appear before these kids and let them know that there is a great opportunity for them. We had an opportunity just recently, one of the community colleges is expanding a respiratory therapy program down into the Livingston, Tennessee, Cookeville area. So we'll have hopefully a full-fledged program there within the next 2 years. It's very close to happening. So one of the things they said had held them up before was, and they'd never done it, was the fact that there were only in that region only about 2 jobs available. So why would they put a school there and teach 10 people when there's only 2 jobs? What I pointed out to them, it's not about the jobs that are right there. It's about the opportunity it gives these young people to travel anywhere in the United States and work. And right now is a great time for that. So back to the hospital question. I'm going to pass it down to folks that might know.
What I've seen in my hospital is a new set of doctors who understand about respiratory therapy now, and that's my infectious disease specialists, who they turn everything over to the ICU people. And I think just with airway clearance, using getting into the new devices, we have byways in my hospital now, so that's made a big difference. We're doing the Volara, and what I do is I recruit my respiratory therapist from inpatient to give her a little time outside the hospital in a different setting to try and keep her joy of life up.
Good, thank you. So the next question is similar, and that is, how have the last few years affected respiratory care in skilled nursing facilities? We've seen reimbursement changes about the time that the pandemic came about. PDPM came into play, which for the first time since 1996 recognized respiratory therapists as a reimbursable service. Now, it's much more challenging than just paying for a respiratory therapist because it's on a acuity level and it's kind of complicated. But pre-pandemic, it got kind of masked by the pandemic because that happened, I think it was the end of 2019. And obviously, we know what happened in 2020. So there's this kind of hidden opportunity out there that now there's a way to get paid in nursing homes. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And how has that affected respiratory care, and what do we see that looking like over the next couple of years?
So we have changed our entire program to focus on the new payment structure, and it really strengthens the need to have respiratory therapists. We not only look at the patients that come into the facility and truly have diagnosis, they're on high flow oxygen or whatever they would have traditionally been seen for, but now we are looking at every patient when they come in the door for any past, especially long COVID, any of those kinds of symptoms now. So I think that just the whole assessment process that we've gone through, we've really revamped it to look at every single patient that comes in the doors now. And like I said earlier, I mean, they actually understand they need respiratory in these buildings now. And it's a completely different respect that we have in there now, for the, especially when we were in those COVID units working side by side with the nurses.
And I'll add, we've seen a real uptick in post-acute care availability of therapists. Number one, it's been easier, if you will, to recruit people, because in the past I don't think post-acute care was seen as a very sexy place to work. And all of a sudden it has become a lot more sexy over the last several years. And it's become a lot more productive. And as Carrie said, these buildings, the administrators in skilled nursing facilities are realizing that whether they're being forced to or not, that they can benefit by having respiratory therapists. There are a couple chains that are very large chains that have committed this year to putting a respiratory therapist in every building that they have. We have in Tennessee, we have 9 skilled nursing facility ventilator units. Those are staffed 24 hours a day by respiratory therapists, and along with other categories of things that they need to do. But we're seeing a resurgence of that since 1998. In 1998, it pretty much went away, and now we're seeing it creep back in. So I think the future is bright in our arena, but again, we have to work at the top of our license, especially in the home care and the skilled nursing facility arena, because we don't have physicians overseeing us and looking over our shoulder to tell us what needs to be done next. We have to make those decisions. So I think it's encouraging for post-acute care right now.
Go ahead. You got something to add?
Yes, so it was, although outside the skilled nursing, we talk about the strength of respiratory therapy. You may or may not be aware in some states, so we know for DMEs, for the people that do respiratory therapists, you aren't paid for it. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but what I will tell you is, do you realize some Medicaid and private payers do pay for respiratory therapy? And it's really interesting, and the more acknowledgement that you can do, and the more it is so important for home care companies to start documentation of outcomes to show to payers, because your outcomes do make a difference, to show to payers and to show to Medicaids, which is also a payer, but kind of a different structure, that if you have a respiratory therapist in the home, look at the cost savings we can do to stop them from being readmitted to the hospital. Because not only do you understand the respiratory therapy medication, you understand the importance of activities of daily living, just walking out to the mailbox. And the other thing too is, in the home care environment, if you teach a person how to be able to walk out to the mailbox, all of a sudden now they feel a sense of worth. And that sense of worth is so important to the patients. And it's so important to the payers, because you know what? If they have less probability of getting sick if they're doing some activity. And I see so many people shaking their heads, but it's so true. And don't become, as a therapist in a DME, don't become, yeah, this is what we do. let's go out and make a difference in the patients that we serve, because it's starting to make a difference. And we have the ability to even change some of the Medicare rules, whether it's Medicare Part B or even Medicare Part A.
Thank you. So let's stay on the topic of telehealth or get on the topic of telehealth for just a second. Maybe Dr. Landon could add some color. You mentioned this a little bit about telehealth and some of the opportunities, but I want to talk just a little bit about physicians. And we've seen during the pandemic that a lot of physicians adopted telehealth. It is a model that has become a big part of medicine, at least in the last couple of years. So the question is, how do you think that's changed medicine, and do you think that it's here to stay for physicians?
Yeah, 43 states have taken away some telehealth already. So once the COVID's gone, so I think it should stay. For me, my patients again travel, I don't know, an hour. Some kid on planes to see me. So the follow-up visits, being able to do it by telehealth and being able to stick it into my my schedule makes a big difference. I want to see them. I go, gosh, I really want them to have to drive an hour to see the effect of the medication and so forth. Again, we've got the mirror spirometer, so now I can do spirometry at home. I can do step testing at home. I can do stretchy pulmonary rehab activities at home. So for me, it's very much in the best interest of the doctor and the patient.
From the home care environment, I think it's going to continue to grow. Let me give you some examples. One of the things that we saw, I served on the Respiratory Care Board for 6 years. And on the North Carolina Respiratory Care Board, one of the issues we dealt with was, how do you set up a CPAP, or how do you set up a ventilator if you're not there in prison, not in prison, because that'd be bad.
It's probably harder in prison, though.
Although we have done prison units, but that's really not what I wanted to say. You know, they let me talk because I wore a suit and don't say words right. But anyway, one of the interesting things that we said back then was, how can we ever allow this to happen? You know, set up a CPAP over the phone. Okay, now all of a sudden everybody's changed because of the COVID, because of what's going on, and realize the expertise of a therapist can certainly make a difference. And we're seeing this happen more and more and more. So I'm going to see it growing, whether you get reimbursed for it or now or not. And I will tell you, I think the future is we can start getting reimbursed for the expertise we have.
So we started our call center about 1.5 years ago now, maybe a little bit more, and this goes into my talk that I'm going to do this afternoon a little bit too, but before I could not imagine oxygen patients answering the phone and talking to us for 20 minutes. They would have been like, you're crazy, I'm not doing this. But nobody wants to go to the physician's offices as much anymore. They don't want to go to the hospital because they're afraid of getting sick. So now with our call center, we're able to get a much larger connection rate with our patients, talk to them, and try to have an intervention beforehand. And you know, the telerespiratory program really goes hand in hand with what the doctor was talking about just now. You know, we can do a telehealth call and can help the patients, you know, order new equipment at home. They don't even have to come in. I mean, it's so much more convenient for the patients, and they're so much more open and responsive to it now than they ever would have been before all of this had happened. So we've just seen a great growth of our oxygen patients' communications.
You see how she treats me. So we were, pre-COVID, we were 100% go to see the patient, talk to them, be in their face. Now we do it, not DME, but we are doing a population health type program. And home ventilation, we would go see those patients as well. But we would go see them all face to face, and then COVID came, and overnight with the flip of a switch, nobody went anywhere to see anybody. So we were forced into going by telehealth, which we all loved and which the patients loved and still do like that today. Expanding on that, we are now looking at a program to start monitoring children in the home, babies in the home, so they can get out of the hospital sooner, along in conjunction with their physician, their pediatric pulmonologist, who will have access to them by way of remote visuals. So to avoid this problem of of a family having to pack up a child that's on a ventilator and travel 3 hours to the major hospital to have a 15-minute visit with the doc who turns one knob and says, now go back home and we'll see you next time. So that's a whole day's worth of a dangerous trip for a child on a ventilator. And the physicians I know that we work with are saying that they feel bad about that and they want to be able to do something different. So this is the method that will be taken with monitoring and the physician being able to do telehealth with the patient. We feel like that's going to be the new wave and it's going to continue on. I don't think it's going to go away, at least here. And it's interesting that we fought so hard for it for so many years, and then boom, overnight we had to flip the switch and make it happen, so we had no preparation. So I hope it stays.
And both those models you guys just mentioned, you said you had a call center, Carrie, and you said monitoring patients. How do respiratory therapists fit into both of those? Because I don't think you guys mentioned how that works with the respiratory therapist and how they will manage those models or be a part of that, or will they?
Oh, they are.
We were leaving some room for you.
Oh, okay.
So we staff with all respiratory therapists, and they are remote. So we partner with DME companies, and we contact all of their oxygen patients, and we track their symptoms. And so once a patient starts to have a decline, we then interject and we reach out to the DME company and we make suggestions. We provide progress notes on all of the things that the patients have told us and the track and the decrease that they've had in their vitals and their symptoms. So all this is in my presentation later too.
Oh, that's fine.
A little bit.
Oh.
So the other thing that we have mentioned was that Zach does have a call center. Encore does, and there'll be some shared services that go on between programs that we create and with that call center and some partnerships there. So we work off each other's strengths, so where they're strong and we don't have something, we'll tag team with them, and likewise we hope they do the same with us. So I think it's a good thing. And respiratory therapists are key because we're 100% respiratory therapists as well.
So if you're watching, did you have something to add, Boone? Okay. If you're watching online, I apologize because I've been flipping through the questions because they're answering my questions as we go. So I was trying to figure out what the next one is. So if you're watching online, it probably makes no sense what question's on the screen and what we're saying. I apologize. Anyway, so we talked a lot about post-acute respiratory programs. What about on the acute care side? I know Dr. Landon's got to leave to catch a plane here in a minute, but you mentioned managing a ventilator patient remotely. Could you elaborate there? Are there some programs out there like that today? I saw a news report last week about small hospitals setting up a RT tele ICU to monitor ventilator patients out in California. So have you seen some of those programs? Can you elaborate on what you think that's going to look like?
Well, we got involved with Children's Hospital Los Angeles around this 10, 15 years ago, and Johns Hopkins would have a pulmonologist, and the same with the adult pulmonologist, because they're just not there in the small places, the smaller towns. But what I was talking about earlier was the ABM respiratory care. We have a televentilator that's in India, and Singapore, and you can have 4 ventilators sitting in front of you. You can change the settings. You see what the pressure curves look like. That'll have to get into the United States, go through the whole process. But
so you can have a ventilator here, change the settings.
I've changed ventilators in India from my house. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, because there's a lack of respiratory therapists in India. I mean, we were doing this in Africa, where there's no respiratory therapist in the entire country, and so there's no expertise. So in low-resourced places like a small town or a foreign country, this is where we run it. My respiratory therapists go, we don't want this here. We'll be out of jobs, Dr. Landon. Everyone will sit at home and do that. That's not going to occur. Mm-hmm. But it would keep them from trying to put on all that personal protection equipment every time they need to change a ventilator, get in there, put themselves at risk. So I see this as a future, but we do need to get the proper materials or proper devices in place.
Yeah, that's good. And you think about the shortage that we have of respiratory therapists, these opportunities to be able to manage more patients remotely and still have the same effect. I mean, it's not really changing care that much, it's just changing how we think about and deliver the care, but we can still do our jobs remotely. So it's an interesting place that we're in, and we're just kind of scratching the surface on that.
Let me just, I do have to go, so I'm sorry about that. But I do want to talk about talking to patients with COPD on the phone. We recruit for studies. They will spend 2 hours on the phone with my recruiters and then say no. So they love to have any kind of attention. But it's, you got to make sure.
So the next question, let's talk a little bit about home care. Thank you, Dr. Landon. Everybody give Dr. Landon a... Came all the way from California to be with us, and was a joy to have him here. So let's talk about home care a little bit. So the last couple years have really affected home care companies. We touched on that, but I want to talk about, as a whole, as a business, home care companies, have they done better or worse during the pandemic?
So my company, we do accreditation. So we see, we have 10,000 DMEs in one form or another accredited. So what I saw was some of the best creativity I've ever seen, all the way to delivering oxygen tanks in the home, all the way delivering oxygen, ventilator care, CPAPs. I saw, like I said earlier, I saw some of the most creative ways of doing it, and these aren't bad ways. These are ways of saying, okay, you know, I'm going to leave him at the doorstep, and then I'm going to call you and work you through it. I can't come into the hospital to deliver this. I'm going to show you how to do it as best I can. Do you have a phone that I can remote in? I saw some of the most creativity ever during COVID, and it needs to continue, and that's why I was real excited that all of a sudden respiratory therapists, you know, for the first, when COVID started, getting on the news, you know, you'd see the nurses and the physicians. Then when they had the first article or said, hey, there's respiratory therapists, I ran in and said, hey, we're on the news, we're on the news. I was excited because they actually mentioned it and actually said respiratory therapy correctly. And I thought that was really exciting that we knew they didn't use inhalation therapy. And for y'all old people, okay, it's just me, but nonetheless, that made a difference with that. So it was really nice to see, but because of that, we're able to keep people home and get people home as well. And the only thing I would have wished is that they would have started reimbursing for our services. And after that, I'll talk a little bit about how that can happen in the future. But it's going to take advocates such as yourself to get that done.
I would say that we had to evolve to become better. And in DME, we're always having to evolve. And when I was working in DME with our company, I said, we either evolve or die. We go out of business. We get bought out as an independent. And seeing, you know, RTs in the home taking care of that higher acuity, whether it be non-invasive or invasive patient, and moving to more of a telerespiratory program with CPAP or BiPAP, I think that's definitely where the industry is possibly going. And it probably won't be too long until, you know, CPAP and BiPAP patients are all telerespiratory, and we're only handling vents and those higher acuity patients.
I mean, a lot of my customers are in here, so I would never say anything bad about any DME company. But this, I have to say, like what Tim was talking about. This has just been the best. I mean, experience to see these therapists and think outside of the box and what they can do. Because I mean, it was just overnight. We can't go into our vent patients' homes anymore. What are we going to do? How are we going to see them? No one had a plan. I mean, that was never even thought of. And then overnight, it's, okay, how are we going to see them? How can we get in there? And people were not very open to it either. And everybody was scared, too. So it was very interesting to see how the DMEs really, I mean, the respiratory therapists that I work with, they were so inventive. And it was amazing to see that. And I think that one of the things that I really like that I still see is that they have opened their minds to technology more, because sometimes I deal with some respiratory therapists that can be a little hard-headed about change, so they don't want to change. And so I think that if anything that's came out of this that's stable is so much more open-minded about, I don't need to see my patient every single month. I'm like, in a perfect world, we would see people based on their symptoms that we were tracking. We would increase our productivity, and we would truly see the patients that needed to be seen, and we would do our maintenance schedules on our maintenance schedules so everyone can still be seen. And that, to me, is what I see now. More people are more focused on the clinical side of it, and the maintenance patients are, the ones that are holding steady, they're good. We're leaving them, we're tracking them, but we're not ignoring them. But we're really focused on the patients that need it now. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen really grow, and I'm the proudest respiratory therapist for in the DME community.
And I say ditto.
So what about, we talked about the evolution that's happening in post-acute care and home care, and it really is changing. And somebody said to me a minute ago in the vendor hall that she said, I remember you 15 years ago, we're talking about how everything's about to change, and we all thought you were crazy. And here we are, right? I didn't predict a pandemic. I'm not saying that, but knew that home care had to change for the better because, it's not even a fee for service. It's a fee for product, right? So a service would be a whole service with it, but it's really a fee for product. So we're below fee for service. So as we kind of evolve from a fee for service model where we get paid for equipment and get paid for what we do into more of a value-based model, because everybody knows that value-based healthcare, it's not a question of is it coming or is it happening, it's a question of when is it going to happen. And it's already happening across most industries, hospitals, physicians. If you look at any of the commercial payers, over half of the money that they spend is in value-based models already, and it's saved them billions of dollars. And so we know that healthcare has changed to value-based care. It's just mainly been in Part A. So it's mainly been hospitals and physicians. Now it's hitting skilled nursing facilities, home health, and so DMEs are really the only ones, home care, that haven't been affected by that change. So to think that we're not going to be affected would be crazy of us. So the question is, what do you think? Do you think the current model is sustainable, or do you think that value-based models will start to evolve, and what would that look like?
Okay, I'm excited about this question. Here's why.
He's been waiting on it.
I know, I've been waiting on it. I know, right? Well, I kind of knew what it was. This is like one I kind of set up. But anyway, I think it's really exciting now because respiratory therapists can make a difference. Let me explain why. If you're in the home care market, you know that we now everything's Medicare under Medicare Part B. Under Medicare Part B, they pay for a concentrator, they pay for a CPAP, and if you're a respiratory therapist, they don't really care. They're paying for the concentrator, they're paying for the CPAP, and whether it ends up in the closet, whether they use it or not, they've paid for it, they're done, no matter what happens. So let's think about Medicare Part A. Before COVID happened, there was a lot of push about Medicare Part A adding the respiratory therapist to Medicare Part A. Let's think about this for a minute. The biggest diagnoses you have in the home care market, some of the biggest, are COPD, CHF. If you're going into the home and you're talking about their oxygen, or you're talking about how to rehab them, what better person to talk about it than an educated respiratory therapist to educate that customer or that client or beneficiary on what to do to improve their CHF. What can they do? Obviously, they're not going to get better, but there's certain things they can do. Same with COPD. So wouldn't it be great if we start marketing, because it's a marketing job, to CMS, the value that we could do if we added a respiratory therapist to the home care. You know, right now, home care pays for what? Nursing, OT, PT, speech. Why don't we add respiratory therapists to that? Then all of a sudden now, I can guarantee you, if you're really going to the home, educating the clients, their outcomes are going to be much, much better. They're going to stay at home much longer. And you know what? They're probably not going to be as cranky. Just saying, COPDers can get cranky. Oh yeah, you know. And so they're not going to be, and talk about ADLs, activities of daily living, they're all going to increase because of what we can do. And that's kind of where we need to go with the market. Okay.
Sure. Positive you don't? Well, I'll say, add to what you said, we need to start pushing CMS. We need to start talking that up. But the number one thing they're going to ask, and I've been through this before, is show me your outcomes. How many of you in here can show me your outcomes for a year or two worth of home oxygen patients? That's going to be the big question. So if we're not monitoring outcomes, if your company doesn't, or if you're in home care and you don't now, you really need to start, because from my perspective, our company, Aventa, is the Latin for outcomes, and from day one, that's what we look at as patient outcomes. We can tell the insurance companies what our outcomes are very precisely. We also use a software that's so famous here at this conference, the Nexus software I heard of. But you know, by way of using that software, we can get that data a lot easier, and it's a lot more impressive if you can go to them and say, "Here's our data, now pay us." If you don't have it, they're never going to pay us, I'm afraid.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add to that was a lot of you may have outcome or value-based programs within your organization now, but is making a note in that patient's chart enough? Having a software to be able to combine all of that data is really where we're going to win at. Ditto.
I also forgot to add, we right now today are working on a pilot project with one of the payers in Tennessee to develop an outcomes-based payment model for home health services, and we also are looking at a outcomes-based model for DME services as well. Once we collect the data over the next year or so, there's a good chance in this next year, 2024, it sounds like a long way off, but we'll probably roll out a program similar to that as a pilot here in Tennessee. So again, if you don't collect outcomes data right now, you really need to start, because that's going to be key in whether you're involved in that pilot or not.
And really key, as they all talked about, to get paid for respiratory therapy services. If we're ever going to get paid, we can't leave it up to AARC to find a way to get us a code. We got to figure out how to do it ourselves, right? And I'm not saying anything bad about AARC, just that we have to pave the way. And some of these models like Gene's doing, where going to the payers and saying, let me build a model for you that's a value-based model. Because if we wait for them to build it, it's likely not going to be a model that we like, right? Anybody ever got a new program from a payer that they really liked? Usually not, right? If a payer pushes something out, it's oftentimes a negative program. So the idea with this is that if we, as respiratory therapists, we're known as the MacGyvers of healthcare, right? Do they still say that in the hospital? We're the MacGyvers. So it's really about saying, okay, well, how do we take that same thought process that we've had technically with equipment and start thinking about how do we create value-based models that can help our hospital partners win, or our physician partners win, or the payers win, because they all get paid based on value now. And so we have this opportunity in front of us, which we're going to talk more about in the next talk. But we have this opportunity that respiratory therapists can shine today more than ever. And if we miss that boat and we don't do it, somebody else is going to. So now is our chance to shine and our chance to go out and create these new models. And everybody out there, physicians, hospitals, payers, are hungry for ways to save money and have better outcomes, because that's the future of healthcare. And so if you bring them those models, then oftentimes they're going to listen to you. Which Gene has experienced many, many times. We have experienced many, many times. If you take these models to them, say this is how we should do it, then that's how you create the value-based model for home care. And once we find successful models like that, payers talk to each other, they replicate that. So we've got to find ways to create a value proposition to get paid for our services, even if there's not a payment under home health, which would be great. But even without that, there's still ways to get paid for our services today. In every environment of healthcare, there's a way to get paid for respiratory therapists. There's a way to help not only get paid for it, but also make a profit for our organizations in providing those services. Okay, so we got one more question maybe. And that question is, more of a personal question maybe. So what would you say is the most important lesson you've learned through the pandemic, the recalls, all the changes that have happened? I'm putting them on the spot. They didn't know this was coming. So what would you say is the most important lesson that you've learned in the last 3 years?
I mean, I'm going to say you have to be flexible, and that's a big challenge for me. But I think that's it. You don't know what's coming, and you have to be able to be prepared, and you have to be able to move with what you have available.
I agree with exactly what you said. We have to be able to turn on a dime, and we have to keep that mentality. We can't run from change. Sometimes change is going to chase us, and we have to run toward it. So always be prepared to take another step and change directions if you have to. Don't be afraid to take a direction that might fail, because as Zach knows, as Kerry knows, that we've had some failures before. We've had these great business plans that just didn't work out. One was buying stock in ValueJet once upon a time, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, you just got to be prepared and be ready to make a change.
I would say the biggest thing that I learned when I was in DME, I used to tell our team that if you take care of the patient, the referrals would take care of themselves. And prior to coming on to VGM, I did work at Philips Respironics throughout the recall, and I applied the same mentality. Take care of the customer and do your best for them that you can, and everything else will fall into place.
I think the biggest thing I learned is that 99% of the DMEs want to do what's right, and that includes the clinical staff and that includes the owners. And they had to work within the parameters that were given to them, which were very difficult, with reimbursement, either whether they need to be accredited or not, or what lapsed with it or not. They really wanted to do the right thing. And I rarely heard of a problem or a case that the DME company, through the ownership or through the clinical staff, didn't do the right thing, even at the cost of what was going on with them losing money or not getting reimbursed. It was an exciting time to learn it. It was a very complicated time, but it really, the big leaders in that got to CMS and said, look what we're doing. Did CMS always hear it? No. But that's okay, because the more we talk about it, of what happened, the better we can say what we did as therapists and what we did as DMEs. We didn't back away. We gave the customers the service that they needed. And that also goes through hurricanes and everything else that we've done, because not only do we do a pandemic, I can't tell you how many of DMEs, you all probably know, were affected by the hurricanes, the bad weather, the flooding, and everything that happened. And no matter what, the call was, how do we take care of our customers? How do we take care of our patients? That's actually heartwarming.
So Jason, 7 minutes left here, 2 minutes left here. Could you help me out here? Are we out of time? Cut the difference? Okay. All right, so I think, okay, how much time I have then?
Well, you're done at
2 minutes. 2 minutes, okay. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank our panelists. And I enjoyed this conversation. I hope you guys did too. So give everybody a round of applause.